Okay, so I understand Jordan Peele's directorial debut Get Out was heavily centered on racial themes that took on this unique perspective on social situations and encounters that many marginalized people go through. But for how personal Peele's story was to him and his experiences living in the hotly divisive culture of America, I actually felt the film spoke more broadly than that. In fact, I found it to be a pretty realistic depiction of human interaction in general. As a comedian, Peele naturally has a more astutely observant eye for social norms and behaviours that us regular folk don't usually think about in our everyday lives. And while my last few videos focus so much on morality and depravity in civilized society, it's refreshing to look at something that has a much more grounded, relatable interpretation of the ordinary world. Bar certain things I can't obviously attest for. After all, as a white middle-class man, the only thing that prevents me from having peak perfect social privilege is that I look like Elijah Wood if he were kicked in the face. The thing is, I don't entirely ascribe to the auteur having the sole interpretation of their work. I think when you create something and put it out there for others, it's naturally going to speak differently to people who come from all various walks of life. Case in point, what spoke to me personally about Get Out was how I saw it as this nightmarish depiction of what it's like for someone with social anxiety and introversion like myself to mingle with strangers and become familiar with unfamiliar territory. I think underneath the social themes Peele addresses in Get Out and his recent film, the topic of this video, Us, which I will get to momentarily, is his vulnerability. This sense of disconnect or alienation, a feeling of imposter syndrome or being so outside your own comfort zone both internally and externally that you feel somewhat disillusioned by the world. Us spoke closer to that uncertain shadow that follows us, that instinct that something isn't right about ourselves, that we hide so much behind masks and personas that prevent people from truly knowing the real us. So let's talk about it. Okay, I'm going to get this out of the way first. I know I did kiss JP's ass quite a bit there because I do think Get Out is a clever, fun and thoughtful horror movie, but I also happen to think that with Us, he kinda ran the risk of being just a little bit too far up his own ass that he doesn't need me kissing it for him. Peele knows that he's clever, and I find it just a little condescending when a filmmaker's overconfidence is projected into their work to the point of borderline pretension, where it begins to think it's something it's not, and that ultimately became the main issue I had with Us. With the polarizing response to his involvement in the Twilight Zone reboot, there's a bit of showmanship from him that worryingly mirrors what happened to M. Night Shyamalan after The Sixth Sense was circle-jerked by critics and audiences as an instant classic. Of course, this isn't Peele's fault. I think internet hyperbole is one hell of a drug when most creators just want to make things that interest them without being placed on a pressurizing podium of unrealistic expectations. Contrary to all the positive things I'm about to say about Us thematically as a film about privilege, it felt like the kind of film our movie details would bust a nut over, rather than something that felt as tightly constructed as Get Out. And really, this all comes down to one core issue. Peele sets up all these abstract ideas and then proceeds to throw a contrived exposition dump that I felt completely undoes everything symbolic about the film. But for context, I will only be able to address this when we get to that later in the video, so bear with me here. Simply put, justifying this entire high-concept ordeal as just some government experiment gone wrong feels like a cheap cop-out that was inevitably going to disappoint anyway. In fairness, Peele was stuck between a rock and a hard place. He was either going to give you an answer that would never meet the expectations of its provocative setup, and there's no way in hell he was going to bypass criticism if he didn't give audiences something to explain all the madness. I mean, I did accept the human experiment context and Get Out as a bizarre 50s-60s sci-fi homage, but Us feels like it's trying way too hard to distinguish itself from every other horror movie out there that I felt that it just didn't quite stick the landing. Granted, this is totally down to my blatant ignorance getting in the way of my unchecked expectations. I personally find it just a little frustrating when a creator plays the auteur card so heavily that it leaves no room for ambiguity, making it all feel just a little less personable. Obviously, the government experiment angle was a play on the government government literally abandoning the marginalized because they didn't meet their standards, but it just conflicts with the Wilson family's intimate narrative that we'll explore momentarily. And since the film opens with this ominous statement about unused underground tunnels and never really does anything more with it, it feels like a disingenuous attempt at adding mystery that's eventually undermined by an indisputable exposition dump. Anyway, with all that negativity out of the way, let's talk about what I actually loved about the film. Bear in mind, when we talk about horror, it doesn't just have to be from an atmospheric perspective. We're looking at us from Jordan Peele's narrative intentions, which is this profound point about privilege. Basically, he presents the horror like this: for us to have what we want, someone needs to suffer. It speaks about the need for materialism to make your home feel like a castle, or to create the illusion that man has power. Interestingly, before the Tethered are even introduced, this is mainly established through the relationship between the Wilson family and the Tyler family. For how downplayed it seems, it actually makes up a major foundation for the film's central theme. It never directly calls it a conflict, but like when I said people hide behind masks and personas, it's that kind of relationship where you get on well with people, but that's not to say you don't have prejudices or gossip to share about them behind their back. For example, Gabe is understandably jealous of Josh for shoving all his materialism in his face, so much so that Gabe decides to obtain a bow to match Josh's materialism, as if that will make Gabe feel better about his own status. He's sensitive to the idea of being viewed as inferior or unable to provide for his family. Gabe is a victim to the notion that materialism is a reflection of your status, yet it really isn't, because it has no reflection on his character, where he's shown to be a kind, caring father who just wants to bring happiness to his family. He feels challenged by some sort of alpha male status, that being a man who's just a flat-out douchebag, represented in how his tethered self acts more like a monkey than a man. Kitty, on the other hand, is just blissfully ignorant of her privilege. She gets a facelift because, again, she falls for the fallacy that her personality is reflected in her status, devolving further into her arrogant daughters, who are just a bunch of selfish, stuck-up brats. They totally get the best death, by the way. The privilege angle does its job at commentating on how we want the best for ourselves at the expense of others, which is bookended by Adelaide being switched by her tethered self, reflecting a literal change in identity, but at the same time, her newfound privilege doesn't reflect back onto her personality. I initially dismissed the twist as just another gimmick to the film's horror, but it actually makes the most sense in Peele's screenplay. It doesn't matter if you worked out the twist early or not in the film, her conflicted sense of self is still the overriding catalyst for the story. She never feels whole, even though she's seen to blend in with her status. There's something consistently uncanny about her, whether it be the fact that she eats food similar to a rabbit, or tries to get her son into the beat of the music despite being out of tune herself, or, most importantly, knows that some sort of inevitable danger is coming, that being she'll be exposed as an imposter. That was the element to the horror that actually got to me. She keeps saying something doesn't feel right, but that's completely abstract. That's not quantifiable. There's no sense as to what she's actually afraid of. There's a tension, but we don't know what it is. Even when the Tethered finally show up, we don't really know what they are or what they truly mean. And that's exactly why the climactic explanation pissed me off. It completely ruins their mystique and the idea that they seem more figurative than real. I simply felt it sucked all the curiosity out of the film because there, you have an answer to your questions. There's nothing left to interpret because Peele wants his commentary to be as precise as possible. The Tethered have a kind of Michael Myers thing going on. Are they human? Are they totally misunderstood? Or are they just some force of evil? The way I saw them at first is that they were a mirror manifestation of each character's fears, or more so, the Tethered essentially being better versions of themselves. You have the daughter, for example, questioning her talents as an athlete that's resolved by her being trusted with her maturity through driving. You have the father going up against the stronger breadwinner version of himself, resolved by killing him with the very materialism that has made him feel weak. And then you have the son, who is going through a similar identity crisis as the mother, who finds strength within himself by regaining control of his tether. However, Adelaide pretty much defines the family's shadows. Since she herself is already a shadow to begin with, it shows us how our fears could be hiding in plain sight. The family try to run away from their shadows, but their shadows are, well, literally tethered to them, so the only way to resolve the conflict is to confront it. And yeah, sure, while this is pretty much the typical expectation for these kinds of stories, it's interesting that the only thing they're truly fighting is themselves. Although in this respect, I guess you could say those that die at the hands of their tether do so because they don't confront the truth or are being punished for taking their lives for granted or something like that. Either way, it does call upon the blatant quote that the man carries saying Jeremiah 11. There's no point in me smugly explaining it when all it requires is a quick Google search to get an answer, but Rosie Fletcher of Den of Geeks summarizes it in a far more elegant manner in how the biblical chapter was a warning about worshipping false idols, which in itself is reflected through the character's overdependence on materialism and technology. You know, fuck the police.
Ophelia, call the police.
Sure. Playing F the Police by NWA.
The police coming straight from the underground.
I know folks will say that I didn't talk all that much about what made Us scary, but putting aside its vague cultural definition, Us represents us with a look at ourselves. That was a weird statement. There's something about how much of our existence is defined by the things around us than for the people we truly are. It's cynical towards how comfortable we've become with all the stuff we take for granted without necessarily having to preach about those forgotten by an elitist society. Us is like a Rorschach test. I don't think it has some definitive, unquestionable truth to it. It's more hypothetical than that, and completely based on your own perception of the world. It's less like a window into reality to confront us with horror, and instead it's a mirror into ourselves, and how we conform and behave in reality, unconsciously aware that so much of what we do for the betterment of ourselves, mentally and physically, can be at the cost of something or someone who we're totally oblivious to. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on Us in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this episode and you enjoy what I do here and you want to support the show at all, please do consider heading over to Patreon, where for just a few dollars a month you can get early access, you can vote on future videos, you can get your name in the credits, and you can get access to our Discord community where you can tell me what you've been watching, playing, reading, share your work, share your art, whatever it may be, talk about whatever you want, within reason of course. So yeah, I hope to see you over there. And until next time, follow me on Twitter and Instagram, stay very, very safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!